Okay, thank you everybody for joining us for part two of our exploration of Ypsilanti's Black history. We're not going to do a debrief from last week. That video has finally been posted, so feel free to look at that on YouTube. We're just to, but to set the scene for where we're going to start today. We're going to start right around the Great Migration, and we're going to start looking at where people are living and working about 100 years ago or so, and then we'll go from there. A reminder that in 1900, Ypsilanti is the city in Michigan with the highest percentage of Black population of any city in Michigan. So again, generally thinking, the Great Migration is that period around World War One in which millions of people move from the southern states, Jim Crow and sharecropping, to the north, and industry to places like Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, St. Louis, Cincinnati, all of those kinds of cities. And most of us, when we think of northern Black urban areas, will think of them in terms of uh, uh, Great Migration cities, right? Those heavy urban centers of Black migration, Chicago South Side, for example, Detroit. But Ypsilanti is different because Ypsilanti has a very settled a Black community before the Great Migration, which will negotiate with that Great Migration, right? There will be new churches. There will be, again, there will be new foods. There will be new all kinds of things that happen when this area sees that mass migration, and Ypsilanti's traditional Black community will become a new community, right, in this process. So what we're looking at here in this first slide is, people may recognize that is Parkridge public housing. It was on the south side, and those buildings existed until just a few years ago. They were built in the World War II period as public housing, and public housing, we'll see how important that was to creating a stable Black community, to keeping out speculators and gentrifiers for many generations. And it is no accident, in my opinion, that when we saw the partial privatization of Parkridge, that was the opening for gentrification of Ypsilanti. When we're putting more and more housing into the market, Black communities will suffer in that situation because the market is frankly racist, right? The market may be blind, but America is also racist, and it's part of it. It's just the way that it works in this country, where race will also determine housing prices, right? And so Black communities, because of the generally low housing prices in a Black community, will be, when those communities get in crisis and people want to move, they will become targets of gentrifying. Targets of gentrifying. You cannot gentrify a community that is stable, right? You gentrify a community in crisis, a community where jobs are lost, a community with an economic downturn. That's what is gentrified. And this story of the night will lead to where we are today, and that is the gentrification of Ypsilanti. And for the first times in the entire history that we're talking about, since the 1860s, in the last 20 years, we've seen the percentage of Black Ypsilanti go down. So that's the first time that has happened since the 1860s. And that is a process of gentrification. It is not unique to Ypsilanti. It is part of a larger process of gentrification of cities that have happened in the last 15 to 20 years. But that will, as we go forward, that is the headlight coming at the other side of the tunnel at us, that gentrification, which we're all feeling right now. If you live in Ypsilanti, if you have lived in Ypsilanti for anything longer than 10 or 15 years, you know that the city is very different today than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And from somebody, from my perspective, who moved to Ypsilanti as a union worker in a grocery store, because this was a place where union workers in grocery stores could afford to have, could afford to live. It's also, we're being priced out, right? So this Ypsilanti's change in racial patterns is also a change in class. Okay, so let's go and see where people are living in the landscape around 1900. Now, when we ended the last session, we looked at this graph and we saw that Black Ypsilanti in the 1860s lived in every ward, right? No ward was predominant the way it is today and has been for over 100 years, of Ward 1, the South Side, being overwhelmingly the Black neighborhood in Ypsilanti. That is a process that happens in the late 1880s as that larger process of Jim Crow and drawing the color line. And as we looked at last week, that process involved everything from loans to getting burnt out of your house, right? That it wasn't a planned process. It was an ad hoc process. And so this is a map of Ypsilanti where Black families are living in 1900. So we're going to parse this out a little bit. So we're going to look at this map. So these red diamonds are where each Black household is living in Ypsilanti in 1900. The blue diamonds are where Black institutions are, Black businesses, Black churches, etc. And the green circles are where Black women are working as domestic servants in Ypsilanti. So the first thing we see, and again, this is 1900, the first thing we see is that the overwhelming majority of Black families are south of Michigan Avenue and west of the Huron River. Ypsilanti has an east-west divide as well as a north-south divide. The east is generally, historically, more German. That's where the German church is, the Lutheran church on the east side of town. It was more working class. It was more artisan. It was called Dutch Town, it was the place of the immigrants, right? Even though those immigrants came in the 1840s, it was still considered an immigrant community in Ypsilanti in the 1950s. German was spoken on the east side of Ypsilanti regularly up until World War I. It was a very different community. Both are white, both are Protestant, both are from Europe, and the Germans drank beer on Sundays. And on the west side, the Methodists didn't drink beer ever. And so there was a real cultural divide, east and west, as well as north and south. Black Ypsilanti lives on south of Michigan Avenue, west of Huron, right? And we see three nodes of Black, three nodes in this pattern, right? Here's the first one, and this is South Adams and Buffalo Street. So this is the original Black neighborhood, the coalescing of a Black neighborhood. So that is the corner where you have the school, the Brown Chapel AME. Second Baptist is just up on Hamilton, and you have the community center right there, what is now the Masonic Lodge. So that's all on the corner of South Adams and Buffalo, and that's right from downtown. That's very close to downtown. That's within walking distance of downtown. This area south of Ypsilanti was considered swampier, lower levels. People could see the Paint Creek. The Paint Creek comes through there. So this wasn't the best land in Ypsilanti. It wasn't the worst either, but it wasn't the best land in Ypsilanti. But this is the area where we see the first concentration of Black families. And then after the Civil War, so this is a pre-Civil War Ypsilanti Black neighborhood. Then after the Civil War, we see many, many families coming from Canada, right, to the United States. They might have cousins who live here, or daughters and sons who live here, and they're going to come to Ypsilanti just the way that millions of white folks were, and people were just leaving the farms in the late 1800s and moving to cities to work in the factories. And this just went, it happened everywhere. It was the urbanization of the United States. And so if you're the area of Black rural population are Canadian farmers who went there in the Great Migration, and the area of Black urban area, or went there in the post 1850 Fugitive Slave Act in the Underground Railroad. And then the urban area they would move to is Ypsilanti and Detroit, right? So we see lots of farming families from Canada, the Kerseys, the Travises, many others who will move to Ypsilanti in around 1900, 1890 from Canada, and they will move on First and Second Avenue. And they are a little bit different than the families who've come before because they're farming families who owned land in Canada. They're not landless. They're not houseless, right? They own property. And so we see on First and Second Avenue a lot of Black property owners owning their own homes and owning that property under there. And they're bringing the wealth that they've accumulated over one or two generations from Canada with them, right? But notice what is here. There's this big empty space right there, and that's where Ainsworth subdivision is today. And that was an area of fields and orchards. It was an apple orchard, and it would serve as a buffer between white downtown Ypsilanti and growing Black Ypsilanti. So instead of Black Ypsilanti moving into this empty space right to downtown Ypsilanti, move much further up Michigan Avenue, right? And then when the Great Migration begins around 1900, and we've got people moving from Tuscaloosa and Georgia and Louisiana to move to Ypsilanti, that community will generally move into the areas south of Harriet Street. So Monroe, Madison, those streets going down to where 94 is. And one of the reasons you don't see that as filled in here is because this is 1900 and the process is beginning to fill in that area. So we've got three migrations of Black communities in this map. We've got the Underground Railroad migration. We've got the migration from Canada to Ypsilanti in the 1880s, 1890s. And then we've got the Great Migration from the south to Ypsilanti. So this is a layered history. And again, this acts as a buffer of a no-go area between white Ypsilanti and the growing Black community. Again, it would make sense just in terms of the geography of this area for Black Ypsilanti, for the community to grow right here, right? This is where it would make sense to grow, but that is not what racist Ypsilanti would allow. It was to grow further away from the downtown area. And notice, even in 1900, there are still Black businesses on Michigan Avenue. By 10 years later, all of those Black businesses will move down to Harriet Street, and we'll get a total division in two downtowns. We'll get a Black downtown and a white downtown. The Black downtown on Harriet on Monroe Street, the white downtown on Michigan. Now, from the 1860s, Black people had businesses on Michigan Avenue, barber shops, ice cream stands, bars, clothing stores. All of those had existed on Michigan Avenue up until about 1900. And that's when Jim Crow becomes so severe that even that is gone, right? Even that is gone. One of the ways to think about it is the Black Barber. The Black Barber was the Black Barber in Ypsilanti and in all northern community was the Black man who owned a business. And because of the way race worked at that time, it was considered unseemly for a white person to wait on another white person, right? So a white man doing the hair of another white man, automatically that white barber is less than the person he's working on. So being a barber was a Black job, and the Black barber cut the hair of the white mayor, et cetera, right? And so the Black barbers in Ypsilanti, interestingly enough, live right at the border of white and Black Ypsilanti. Physically, they live where they live socially, that barrier between white and Black Ypsilanti. But Jim Crow comes in, and it becomes taboo for Black men and white men to even touch each other, right? The division becomes a physical division as well as a social division. And then you get the birth of the white barber to be able to cut the hair of the white middle class, right? And it's amazing how the role of barber then changes to become something much more middle class in our idea of what it is, right? when it changes there. And so in these green dots of domestic workers are also interesting. You'll notice a few black families living on the east side of Ypsilanti, but generally no. And there are also no black domestic workers on the east side of Ypsilanti. And that is not because there were no wealthy families on the east side of Ypsilanti. There were up and down River Street and Michigan Avenue were very lofty homes, and they certainly had servants. So what are we seeing? We're seeing that division I talked about earlier between East and West Ypsilanti. The east side of Ypsilanti are the immigrants, so-called, from the 1840s and 1850s. And to say that they have made it in America, well, who do you hire to be your servant? The new wave of immigrants. So if I were to show you where Irish domestic servants work, they're all working on the east side for German wealthy people, right? And black women are working on the west side for the liberal college professors. And so who you hire says something about you, right? If I'm a white liberal college professor and I hire a black domestic servant, I'm pronouncing my liberalism. And if I am a German, second generation German hiring an Irish immigrant to serve for me, I am pronouncing my Americanism, right? Like today, if I buy a Prius, I'm saying I care about the environment. If I buy a Hummer, I'm saying I don't give a damn about the environment, right? It's saying something about me, right? And so what we're seeing with where black domestic workers work in Ypsilanti is the class division among white people, not black people, right? Because race is a relationship. It's always a relationship, right? There is no black without white. There is no rich without poor. They exist in tandem. They exist with each other to define over and against each other all of the time. So that's what we're seeing. And if we were to look, and we will look at a map at the end of this session of where black people live in Ypsilanti today, it is virtually this map. So what took 40 years to get segregated, right, which was not segregated, at least in terms of neighborhoods, it has been set in stone. And it's a very hard thing then, once you do that, to unset that stone. The way it happens is with a crisis like gentrification, Okay, so black labor in 1920, I actually did this. I went through and saw where everybody worked and what they were doing. And it says some very interesting things about Ypsilanti. So let's do the Great Migration again. What is the Great Migration? The Great Migration are black folks moving from the South to come to the North to work in heavy industry, right? And that is in part because heavy industry has been racialized. So this is the era of the steel mill. And the steel mill is hot, heavy work, right? And on the East Coast, who did you get to do that hot, heavy work? You got Southern European and Eastern European immigrants. That's who did that work. And it was literally a racial construct. The closer you are to the equator, Italians, Greeks, the easier chance you will have to work in this steel mill. Black people live closest to the equator. This is the thinking. I'm not kidding. This is the thinking. This is that biological racism that is unfortunately making a comeback back in our minds, that race is a biology rather than culture and social constructs, right? That race rather than racism actually exists. Race does not exist. Racism exists everywhere, right? So but that racializing of employment, which still exists. Black people are far more likely to be in manufacturing today than white folks. So when we have this image of the white worker working in the factory, that's false. That's a black woman, most likely in this area. But the Great Migration is reversed in Ypsilanti. Ypsilanti already has an existing black population. So what we see is that heavy industry move to Ypsilanti to take advantage of an existing Black population. And in the 1890s, these two communities, Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, become totally different culturally, socially, class-wise. Ann Arbor makes a concerted decision in the 1890s to throw all their baskets into University of Michigan, and Ypsilanti makes a decision to throw their baskets into industry. So Ypsilanti creates an infrastructure for industry. It creates a sewage system and an electrical system that are publicly owned to be able to invite in businesses. Ann Arbor does not have that, right? That's what they don't have that. And so we get these big, heavy industries, two in particular, that open up in Ypsilanti: U.S. Steel and Central Specialty. One is where Corner Brewery now is, and the other is where the Ford plant now is. And if we look at these job titles, we'll see that many of these laborers will work in there, but we'll see that by far the largest group of Black men are working in these steel mills, right? So we've got these fire tenders, there's 12 of them. We've got the molders, right? We see here that people are, where is it? U.S. Press Steel, there's 730 work in the foundry, 12 in Hoover ball bearings. So the steel mills that are emerging in Ypsilanti and then will really take off with the auto industry they come here to take advantage of Black labor, right? So the majority of Central Specialty is Black workers. A near majority of U.S. Press Steel is Black workers, where the Ford plant will be. When Ford puts in his plant in 1929, all of those Black workers will have to find another job. So we have very few people that you would say are working in professions, very few. And then if we look at women, women are working in housework and in private families. So they're cleaning for white families, right? And in this period, I think it's black men and white men will work together on the lowest levels of the work, right? So ditch digging, sewers, that kind of stuff. White men will work together. They will work together in some of the factories. White women and Black women working together is almost unknown in Ypsilanti. So there are no Black women working at those huge woolen mills that have hundreds of white women working at them. They might work there, but it would be as a janitor, not on the line. So there's a starker differentiation between white women and Black women at work than there is among white men and Black men at work. Again, these low-skilled jobs are not low-skilled jobs. If anybody has spent time like I have stocking shelves and unloading trucks, I would invite any doctor to take that job and see how long they last at it, right? Skills are defined by all kinds of things, and to get up to go today every work at a hard job is a skill, believe me, is a skill. Okay, so that's where people are working. And so we see what we see around the country. We see Black labor devalued and exploited, right? That doesn't mean the value that Black folks were adding to society is valueless. They're working at the key industries in the society, right? But their labor is valued less than white labor and therefore can be exploited. We can put Black workers into this steel mill for less than we could put white workers, and then we can lower the wages of everybody that way, right? And the union movement, the labor movement, refused to see that and created barriers to Black membership, except for the molders, which we'll talk about in a moment. But we're going to talk now a little bit about segregation and how that, when you got off of work at the factory and you wanted to go to the theater, how did that work in Ypsilanti now in Michigan Avenue, now that we have this kind of Jim Crow? And we're going to talk about a man named Manchester Roper. And all of you will recognize, if you know Ypsilanti, you'll recognize the Worth Theater. It's right across the street. It's not the Worth Theater anymore, of course. It's the old Ypsilanti Opera House. It's right across the street from the Michigan Avenue Library. And Manchester Roper was the valet, the servant for the Quirk family. And Daniel Quirk was known for putting on blackface productions. He loved theater. He was a very wealthy man. They owned the Peninsular Paper Company. His daddy was mayor, his son is mayor, et cetera, et cetera. And the Quirk family, I think they think of themselves as liberals. They hire black people where the real racists wouldn't even have hired black people to be their valets. And you can imagine Manchester Roper, the valet for the Quirk family. And the Quirks are notorious for putting on blackface shows. They're not hiding it, right? And so your boss loves the theater and puts on blackface shows. And Manchester Roper, when he gets off work, he tries to go to the Worth Theater to see shows. Now, we talked before about Michigan civil rights laws. Michigan has passed civil rights laws in the 1880s, which make it at least theoretically illegal for to deny people entrances to theaters and buses and all of those kinds of things, at least theoretically. And so Manchester Roper knows that. The Worth Theater denies Manchester Roper the ability to sit where he wants to sit and says, you got to sit upstairs. So Manchester Roper goes in, buys a ticket, sits where he wants to sit. There becomes an issue. The police come. Manchester Roper leaves. The next day, another black man, Alfred Anderson, will come, try to sit, right? This is it between 1914 and 1919, right? That this happens. And the black community, these black men will just keep going in and they keep bringing it to trial. They keep bringing it to trial. So we see the fourth trial of A.M. Rennie. He was the manager of the Opera House, has been set for July 7th. The complaint is Manchester Roper, who declares Rennie discriminates against colored people in the management of his show. We'll keep after justice until we get it, declared Manchester Roper Tuesday morning when asked as to the course of his case. These were, again, this is the community that came out of the Underground Railroad, that came out of the struggle against slavery, that came out of Reconstruction, and now they're facing a giant retreat in some ways to what we're seeing today in expectations and rights and privileges and all of that kind of things, both demanded and enforced by the government. Only when the theater was sold, becoming the Worth Theater, did the policy of lawsuits stop. Manchester was born in Buxton, Ontario in 1857 and lived on South Adams Street, working as a brick mason, coachman for the Quirk family, and janitor, among other things. He passed away in 1926. There are many Ropers still in Ypsilanti today who should be deeply proud of Manchester, who simply refused the new regime. So that was Black Ypsilanti. So we've got an important struggle that will develop in Ypsilanti around segregation, and it will become a national struggle. We'll have two important national struggles, one which will become very national around housing and segregation, or around segregation in Ypsilanti. In this one is around the school. And remember when we talked about the first word school and H.P. Jacobs setting it up, and it was a real symbol of Black self-determination. We had Black principals here in Ypsilanti. We had Black teachers, the first Black principals and Black teachers in the state of Michigan. The demands were that the school have a bit of its own autonomy, and it had that, but it, of course, didn't have the ability to raise funds, right? That went through the Ypsilanti School Board, and the Ypsilanti School Board starved the Adams Street School of funds, much the way it happens now, where, if you walk into a public school in Birmingham, Michigan, they have catering. And if you walk into a public school in Detroit, the water doesn't run, right? So you can, just because you're a public school doesn't mean you're going to get public services, right? And at the same time that the South Adams Street School doesn't have, its roof is caving in. The students have to go to a latrine for the bathroom. There's no electricity. The heat is a coal fireplace in the middle of the room called smoky, right? That's the condition of the first ward school around 1915. Exactly at the same time, Ypsilanti is building the brand new high school on Cross Street. That is the senior center, or was recently the senior center. So that school is, and that is, it's still a beautiful building, right? So that school is going up at the same time and that's for white students. About 6, 7 Black students would have gone through Ypsilanti high schools in this period. Very few would have graduated high school. More graduated from Eastern Michigan than from Ypsilanti high schools, right, in this period. A lot of working people did not graduate high school. My father was the first person to graduate high school in his family, right? A lot of working class people went to 14, 15 years old, and then you went off to work, right? So it's not entirely unexpected, but it's a much higher percentage than it is among white folks who don't go. And so that was the final straw was when the demand to do something about the south overcrowding on the south side. They literally took the work sheds used to build the Cross Street School, brought them down to the lot on South Adams Street, and that was going to be the overflow for Black students on South Adams Street. So that led to Herman Kersey, right here, this man right here, the son of James Kersey and the brother of Bernice Kersey, the teacher at the First Ward School. Now, will lead them to put a petition, and that petition will be signed. Here you can see there's another petition here, and you can see Herman Kersey and Alfred Anderson. That's John Anderson's son, and Paul Clay. They're all the leaders of the NAACP here in Ypsilanti that begins in that period. Many of them the children of people who escaped from slavery. And they'll lead this effort, and they get all of Ypsilanti, Black Ypsilanti, to sign a petition saying they need a new school. And so the city decides that they'll put forward a commission to investigate how bad the school is. If you walked by, you would notice it, I'm sure. So, but they had to have a commission first, and they did find, in fact, that what the Black Ypsilantians were telling them was the truth, and that the school was falling apart. And so they said, what we'll do is put forward a new bond measure to the city of Ypsilanti's residents to build a new school on the south side. And Black Ypsilanti said, but you've just built a brand new school. We're going there. We want to go to the school on Michigan Avenue. And so Black Ypsilanti rejects the bond. They vote, it goes to a vote. Black Ypsilanti votes against a bond against to build a new school for Black Ypsilanti with the demand, we want to go to the school you just built, because we know if we go to that school, it won't be starved of funds, right? To have full access, we need to go to where you go, because we know that you will not starve your children of funds the way you will our children. So we want to go to where your kids go. That's the demand, right? And Ypsilanti, of course, says, no, that's not going to happen at Ypsilanti. And so it has to go to a court case. And it actually, it is written about by W.E.B. Du Bois in the Crisis magazine, because it happens during World War I. And I don't know if people know about that period, but in World War I, the NAACP said we won't fight segregation during World War I, in the hope that our support for the war effort will mean concessions to us after the war. So it was a very reformist, if we support a war we don't agree with, maybe we'll get something out of it on the other side. That was Du Bois's position and the NAACP position during the war. And Ypsilanti apparently didn't get the memo that they weren't supposed to take court cases during this period, because they take court cases during this period and force the issue with the NAACP, in fact. And so the lead attorney for the NAACP is Robert Bagnall. And he'll become a major figure in the NAACP and throughout the country. And the lead attorney will be Charles Mahoney. So Robert Bagnall and Charles Mahoney, if you know anything about Black Detroit history, are major figures in the NAACP and not just in Detroit, but the entire Midwest region. They will in part get their start. Bagnall will come to prominence in the NAACP in this campaign to bring the city of Ypsilanti to court over its segregated school system. So here's the petition. We, the undersigned colored citizens of the city of Ypsilanti, residing in the first ward of said city, hereby petition you as an officer of the county to investigate the action of the school board. We are paying a large tax for the building of a new schoolhouse. It is used for white to the exclusion of colored children. Our school, a ward school in the first ward, has no connection to the sewer. It is unsanitary, not healthful, but we are compelled because we are colored and the school board is white to put up with whatever they hand us. The schoolhouse is not sufficient or satisfactory. What do we get? Do we get new? No, simply get an old discarded building and poor building moved to another part of the city and placed out in a dusty street or nearly so. It is within 5 feet of the street line and thus cuts our view up and down the street. Part of the time we've had undesirable teachers, part of the time partly qualified, but we've had to take it. Now, all we ask is our fair share for our tax money. Black Ypsilanti is paying taxes for that white school. And our rights under the 13th Amendment of the Constitution and a slight chance, and we will show how far we can improve. Please insist that we get a fair deal. So that is from 1917, that petition. Okay, and this is Robert Bagnall right here, and this is Charles Mahoney. These are the 3 last teachers of the school, and this is in February 1919. This is Bernice Kersey right here. This is Ruth Sykes Penn right there, and this is Jeffrey St. Clair Price, and he was the last Black teacher principal of the South Adams Street School. He would go on to write, on the basis of his work here in Ypsilanti, pioneering essays on racial disparity in testing in the 1920s, and he would become the dean of Howard University. So he was the last Black principal at South Adams Street. The case is tried before Judge Sample in the spring of 1919. And again, this is tried on Michigan law, not federal law, and so that's why it's tried in a Michigan court. And the court finds in favor of Black Ypsilanti. Yes, the city has segregated school system. So what happens then to Ypsilanti? Because we still have a segregated school system here. So what happened in Ypsilanti? So what the school board said after that court case was that we will no longer have schools based on race in Ypsilanti. They will now be based on where you live, which is just another way of doing. We saw that 98% of Black Ypsilanti lives in the first ward. So this picture is the last picture of the segregated schoolhouse in Ypsilanti. There it is right there. It even says under here, it says in quotes, colored school. So people knew exactly what that school was. There's a young Bernice Kersey right there. That's the last one, February 1919. And it's cut off right here, and I apologize for that. There are more students on this side, but this is the first class at what was built for the Black community, Perry School or Harriet Street School, in 1925. What is the difference in racial dynamics between these two pictures that says one is segregated and the other is desegregated? Can anybody see? It's the teacher is white. Because the idea in a desegregated school, the possibility would be that Bernice Kersey may end up going to the second, as a sub and have to teach white children. So desegregation of Ypsilanti schools did not desegregate the schools. They're still as segregated as they were, but they did get Bernice Kersey fired from teaching in 1919. This is her in 1919. This is her in the 1960s. She would be rehired again by the Ypsilanti Public Schools 30 years later in 1949 by Eugene Betty, the Black principal of Harriet Street School. Will hire her again in 1949. She will work the rest of her life as the most beloved teacher in Ypsilanti history. Look at that face. Every old timer I've ever met, and I mention the name Bernice Kersey to, and their face lights up because she was the best teacher in Ypsilanti. She cared deeply about these children. She gave up her own job in the struggle against segregation that her brother led and was not hired because of racism in Ypsilanti for 30 years. This city denied itself the finest teacher available to it for both Black and white students because of its racism, right? So racism not only hurt Bernice Kersey and the Black community, it hurt every single white child who missed the opportunity to have this woman as a teacher. That's what it also did, right? Bernice Kersey's family is still very much alive here in Ypsilanti, and Bernice has a plaque in her honor on Brown Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church. And when I was asked a couple of years ago, they were renaming a school here on the east side of Ypsilanti, and they asked me if there's any person I thought it should be named after. The very first person I said, well, of course it should be Bernice Kersey. I think it's called the Washtenaw International School, WISD. Anyway, it's not named after Bernice Kersey, unfortunately. Okay, so the Great Migration. We're talking about literally millions of internal migrants, right in that period, and this is a demographic shift, but it's also a class shift. That black before the Great Migration, the vast majority of black people in the United States lived on the land in some way, as sharecroppers, as small farmers, as agricultural laborers, right? And that will shift in a generation where the vast majority of black people in this country will be working for wages, many of them in the factories of the North, right? That's a huge shift, not just for the country, but for the Black United States, right? It's not just a geographical shift, not just a demographic shift, but a class shift. It's a shift in how you make your way in the world, right? And it leads to less isolation, as you can imagine. Being a sharecropper on a plantation in Louisiana is different than working at the Rouge plant with 40,000 other people, right? That those are two different worlds. One has very limited amounts of power. The other one has the power to shut down the world, right? And so we'll see that negotiation happen. Thousands will come to Ypsilanti from rural areas of the Midwest and from the great. So it's not just people coming from the South to Ypsilanti. Again, it's black rural communities from the North coming to Ypsilanti to also work in the factories. So we'll see Ypsilanti's black population double between 1910 and 1920. Double again between 1920 and 1930, double again between 1930 and 1940, and then double again just between 1940 and 1945. At the same time, the white population is also, of course, growing. So it's not that Ypsilanti, the city it's keeping up with in fact, becoming larger and larger. So by about the end of World War II, Ypsilanti is about 1/3 black. So it goes from about 20% black, 1/5 black, to about 1/3 black in a generation, which is a big change, a big change. It also means that uh, 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 that change is also geographically shifted into the county and the township, and we'll also see that. Now, Ford is one of the few of the big three. He's the only one of the big three who will hire black men. Now, a lot of people think that Ford is less racist than the other companies. Absolutely false. There is an internal segregation inside of Ford. So Ford will hire black men, but not as tool and die, right? Not as skilled trades, right? You're internally segregated. You're going to be working as the fireman, the person who shovels the coal into the furnaces. You're going to be working in the steel mill. To this day, Rouge Steel, I don't know who owns it now, but it was Rouge Steel, at least last year, is majority black, right? The big steel mills in Monroe, to this day, majority black. In Toledo, to this day, majority black. And the steel workers, Gary, Indiana, right? One of the blackest cities in the United States. That is the steel center of the United States, Gary, Indiana. So steel is important. Black men and steel in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and today are very important. And will the first unions for black men, or that black men will be a part of in Ypsilanti, will come out of that work. Now, Ford hires through the black churches, and he has churches that support him. And in Ypsilanti, the church that supports him is Second Baptist. Brown Chapel AME is a pro-UAW, a pro-union church, and does not support Ford. And that division will happen all over the country where Ford is. Certainly happened in Detroit. And so you get hired from Ford out of a black church, and you have to sign a little thing saying, I will not smoke, I will not drink. I will live in a Ford home. I will not join a union or the Communist Party. I will go to church. All of these, you had to sign a waiver of good service, right? And then the $5 a day is also a myth because to receive the full $5 a day, you had to agree to live in one of Ford's homes in Inkster, and $2.13 would be taken out of your paycheck every week for that, right? So it was a plantation on a vast scale, the Ford company. And very few women were hired, black women are hired into the Ford company. It's black men who are hired into the Ford company. Now, remember what I said about the growth of the population here, about people moving in here. That's also the period of the Great Depression. So we don't have any house building, right? We have a total housing slump. So we have this huge growth in population with people doing different things, right? Working for wages rather than living on a farm. You rent homes rather than live in a home. You rent an apartment, right? And so you've got a change in the nature also of how black people live in Ypsilanti. People become renters. People rent from existing black homeowners because there are no new homes that can be built. And if you're black and you live on the south side, you're not getting a loan to build your home all at once. Even a poor white family will get a loan to build their home all at once. For a poor black family, you'll get the loan to do the first floor or the basement, and then you'll have to pay off that loan before you can get the second loan to do the first floor. That might be 5 years later. You're going to use a different contractor, different materials, different builders, etc. The houses on the south side of Ypsilanti look different than they do in other parts of Ypsilanti because of that. And it's, again, it's not simply poverty. White folks are poor in Ypsilanti too. It's about access to loans and the racist allocation of loans. And everybody, Ypsilanti does not have redlining because the bank manager in Ypsilanti, Mr. McAndrew, knows where everybody lives in his head. He knows where every black and white, everybody does in Ypsilanti, right? They have the redlining in their head already. They don't need a map of it. They know every family and where they live, right? So just because we don't have those redlining maps in Ypsilanti doesn't mean that we don't have redlining. It also, frankly, there was segregation before redlining, and we haven't had redlining since 1949, and there's plenty of segregation today. Redlining did not create segregation. Redlining just announced what was already there, right? It just codified the existing reality. It didn't begin segregation, and ending redlining didn't end segregation. There's a whole lot of other stuff that's going on around money and finance other than redlining, right? And the market in houses and the market in land is determined by prices. And everybody knows that prices in black neighborhoods are lower than white neighborhoods. Every single real estate owner, whether they think about it consciously or not, they know that, right? And that becomes part of how you sell land, right? That becomes part of the negotiation. Is it a white or black neighborhood? How white? How black? Is it transitioning? That's a word I hear all the time about Ypsilanti, right? What people are really talking about is housing prices. That's what they're talking about, right? And so we have very little home building as we get this mass migration, very little community infrastructure building. We've got the most, we're at one of the most racist periods in Ypsilanti history, the most denial of Black Ypsilanti access to voting rights, et cetera, et cetera. Out of this great migration, of course, we get activism. And I think the 20s are a period of retreat. And we don't see a lot of activism in Ypsilanti in the 20s. We see a real retreat, I think. And there's, well, obviously, there's a pushback, the way there's a pushback today, right? There's a pushback to the gains that Black people made around World War I. And that was pushed back in the 20s. And in the 30s, then you see a reemergence of a Black politics. And it's on the basis of that great migration. And it's on the basis of Black people working in factories in the North now. And we get something really interesting, a thing called the National Negro Congress in the mid 1930s. And this is the most important activist coming together of Black activists in the United States at that time. And you can see this, you can see the National Negro Congress call in 1936. And we will have several important leading members of the National Negro Congress from Little Ypsilanti. In fact, 18, I think it's 18 people from Ypsilanti went to the Michigan State Convention of the National Negro Congress as delegates. So we had a lot of delegates. Ypsilanti had a lot of delegates. A couple of those people are right here. This is Dr. Lawrence Perry, that's the name of Perry School is named after him, and he was probably the foremost leader of the National Negro Congress in Ypsilanti. The National Negro Congress, nobody will be surprised who knows anything about political and social history in the 1930s, was connected to the trade union movement and connected to the Communist Party. And we'll see that connection in Black Ypsilanti become very strong in the 1930s, very strong. And Black communists, Black activists will be leaders, will be the leaders of Ypsilanti in the period of World War II, And then, of course, another reaction to that. Here is Lillian Bell. She's also a leading woman figure of the National Negro Congress here in Ypsilanti. And that National Negro Congress is working in tandem with the CIO. So the UAW CIO is beginning in 35, 36, and the CIO, unlike the AFL, wants to organize all Black people and all women into the same unions. Right. So it's a shifted environment now, and it's coming into Ford. The CIO and the UAW is coming into Ford and beginning to make its appeal to Black workers. And you didn't have to appeal to Black workers to organize a union for GM or for Chrysler, but to do it for Ford required not just an appeal to Black workers, but Black leadership of the union, right? Otherwise, Black rank and filers are not going to follow white leaders of the UAW. You have to have Black organizers and Black leaders of the UAW to be able to organize these Ford plants. And that's exactly what we see. And those Black leaders of the UAW will become the most important political figures, Black figures in Ypsilanti history. They will become the first Black elected officials in Ypsilanti history, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so Ainsworth and Harriet. So remember what I was saying about that growth in the 20s of the population and very little housing growth. And yet we have a big, beautiful, I don't know how big Ainsworth is. Some people on the call may be from Ainsworth. I think it's 40 or 60 acres. It's not small, right? It's not a small area. And it was an empty area just east of Hamilton, just south of Michigan Avenue, yards from downtown Ypsilanti. It would be the number one place to develop for new housing or new development. The problem for the developers is it's completely surrounded by Black community that we saw before, right? And you are not going to develop the Black community. That's simply not going to happen in this period. So what do? You need housing, you need development. You have this empty space, but it's completely surrounded by a Black community. So you create an apartheid road system in Ypsilanti to make sure that the Ainsworth subdivision will have no access to it from a Black street. So how do you get into Ainsworth subdivision? You get in on Michigan Avenue. Originally, you'll notice in this first plan, there was a thought to have the road go through Buffalo, right? So you could come straight on Hamilton. We all know that road is not there. There is here this is Hawkins Street, Hamilton Street, and Harriet Street. These are all three Black streets that completely surround Ainsworth subdivision, and there is no access, right? This is apartheid Ypsilanti style. This is creating a white enclave within a Black neighborhood that will have different access points to make sure that people don't see each other on a day-to-day basis, right? And one of the problems, of course, is that Hamilton is largely a Black street, and the families living down here are Black. And so this is one of the areas, because it's one of the few areas inside the city of Ypsilanti to be developed when covenants were being written. Most of Ypsilanti either is older than that or after that. So we don't have a lot of covenant neighborhoods in Ypsilanti. A few, College Heights and stuff like that, but there are not many. Ainsworth, and again, we still have segregation. Ainsworth is a covenanted neighborhood, and so these black families living here were covenanted out. So the Wright family, living at 214 South Hamilton, was recently zoned to be in the Ainsworth subdivision. Now, the covenants say you can't sell your land, right? You can't, you're a white person and you can't sell your land to a black person. Uh, uh, the rights, the people who owned that land ignored, the white folks ignored that covenant. And so there were families, Black Ipsy, this family, the Wrights, were taken to at least nine. Here's the ninth hearing. Were taken to court by their white neighbors to try to get them to move out of Hamilton Street, right? This is all through the early 1940s. This is the arsenal of democracy in that period when we're building the war, the planes that will win the war against fascism, and black people can't live on the street that they've already lived on right here for forever. So that home at 214 South Adams Street is still there. I think there should be some sort of acknowledgement that that home was a place of conflict between about racist Ypsilanti trying to drive out black people from an existing black neighborhood. We're not even talking about somebody moving into a white neighborhood. It's they wanted to expand the white neighborhood into the black neighborhood. Right. So that's Ainsworth subdivision. Of course, though the Supreme Court's declared those covenants illegal in 1948, in 48, or unenforceable. They were declared illegal in 68. I don't know when. I've heard a couple of people claim to be the first families to bust the covenant in Ainsworth. It certainly was busted early, 1950, something like that. I know that Mr. Curry from Curry's Barbershop, he says he was in there early with his wife. So the Ypsilanti was able to bust Ainsworth subdivision, and of course, Ainsworth subdivision is not exclusively white at all. But this is also the period that Harriet Street begins. Okay, so 1941, the UAW wins at Ford, and that is going to change everything. And this is, remember, that if you're black and you're in Ypsilanti, there's a good chance in 1939, there's a good chance you work for the Ford Corporation, right? And there's 100% certainty you do not work for the Ford Corporation in Ypsilanti because the Ford plant that is on the Huron River here in Ypsilanti is what's called a village industry, and it will hire no black people. Absolutely not. So if you live in right by the Ford plant here in Ypsilanti on Grove, you can't work there. You've got to drive to Dearborn every day to work at Rouge Steel or on the line, right? And if you're white and living in Dearborn, you might have to drive out to this village plant to work, right? So the Southeast Michigan is a mess, right? Where people live does not correspond to where they work, and both of those are defined by race, right? And we're going to have the chickens will come home to roost on that conflict, right? Here's an open letter to black Ford workers, and you can see some of the people who signed it. Here's John Conyers' dad, Charles Hill, and this is telling black workers that that what we have received from Ford, right, which what Ford thinks he has given us, right, is not a gift. It is to keep us passive and the union out. And we are not, and I had to even look up what does bandana days mean? And that's an old Jim Crow, like black minstrel singing thing. And this says, well, the bandana days at Ford are over. We are not bending the knee to King Henry Ford anymore, and we're going to demand a union. And again, uh, 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 that is that is a huge shift, right? So the Ford is the last place to have a union, in part because black workers have been loyal to Ford because there is no other option to work. You don't work at Ford, you don't work, right? And so that loyalty is understandable. And now the UAW is proposing an alternative. And that alternative is not take what you get. The alternative is demand what you want, right? And that rings true to many people, especially during World War II, when we're supposed to be fighting for democracy, right? So Ford will open Willow Run in April 1941. When does the United States enter World War II? December 1941. Pearl Harbor was not a, we all knew there was going to be a war, right? It's not like the United States was just sitting over here minding our own P's and no, they were building for the war they were going to enter, right? And so they begin building bombers, the bomber plant in April before Pearl Harbor, well before Pearl Harbor, right? And Henry Ford, they begin to build the plant exactly at the time the UAW wins against Ford. And one of Ford's reactions to the UAW victory in April 1941, where black workers did support the walkout, brought Henry Ford to the negotiating table, made him sign a contract, right? That he claimed he would never do. We'd all have to walk over his dead body before we would see that. Well, we forced it. We forced it on Ford. And his response to that was a hurt father. Okay, I won't hire any black folks then. And so when Willow Run opens, no black people will work at Willow Run. Absolutely none. In fact, Ford will do a hiring freeze for all black people about right after April 41. And it's unofficial, but it's widely written about and discussed. And it will last until Black Ypsilanti and Black Detroit breaks Ford again in 1942-43. So immediately, here's the you can see 3,000. Also, women are not hired to begin with at Ford at all at Willow Run. We think that's what happened, but what happens is there's a labor shortage because Henry Ford does not want to hire the black folks living around here. Remember, Henry Ford goes to Kentucky to get workers rather than hire the 750,000 of black women who live in the Detroit region, right? And so the labor shortage is a racist labor shortage. It's saying, I don't want anybody who has anything to do with the union movement or black folks to work in my plant. So I'm going to go down to Kentucky and find people to work in my plant, even though there are tens of thousands of unemployed black men and women sitting right within eyesight of Willow Run, right? And so there's a huge crisis. Willow Run is a huge turnover, too. For every person who goes through the front door, it's a terrible job. There's 3 who walk out the back, right? It's very hard to keep that plant running in those first years because it's such a hard job. It's such a terrible job. And also, a lot of the people hired have had no experience working on a factory line at all. And so and then you've got Henry, that becomes tens of thousands of people then moving to this area. And the community will not build homes because it's okay to work here, but if you live here, you'll vote here. And all of a sudden, Ypsilanti will not be, the pinky fingered who's in charge in this town will be upset rather dramatically. And at that point, Ypsilanti was extremely strongly Republican and pro Henry Ford. And if you invite a lot of auto workers to come live in Ypsilanti, the city is going to become Democratic and pro UAW rather quickly, right? So one of the issues was that the local real estate officers, the local home builders, and then certainly local and city governments did not want to build any homes for anybody, white or black, during World War II. And so we've got an issue of thousands of people living in trailers working at the most working at the most technologically advanced factory that had ever been created by human hands, and they are working in that, and they don't have running water because Henry Ford and everybody else does not want black folk or doesn't want working folks living in Washtenaw County. So you've got a real crisis developing here in Southeast Michigan. You've got a crisis around housing, you've got a crisis around race, you've got a crisis around jobs. And you see the UAW and the NAACP come together with the Urban League, groups like the National Negro Congress, to struggle over housing, to demand that housing be built for war workers in this area who are working here, and then that housing also be open to Black families. Now, that and first off, and that Willow Run also hire Black people. So you get a series of sit downs, of occupations, of Black women going to the hiring halls and demanding to be hired in 1942 and 43. You've got demonstrations against Jim Crow of tens of thousands of people in Detroit, and you've got a demand from A. Philip Randolph for a march on Washington in 1943 demanding jobs and justice. Has anybody ever heard jobs and justice in a march on Washington? That march was delayed and delayed and delayed until 1963 when Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. Look at the pictures of that speech, and it's the UAW marching, right? And with for jobs and justice. And that was the march that was supposed to happen in 1943 against Jim Crow in war industries and war housing. And so we've got an issue here where it's combustive. It's combustive. In 1943, a Black housing project is built in Detroit. It's called the Sojourner Truth Housing Project. A white mob occupies it and says that we demand housing for white people. So even the housing for Black people built there was denied to them by a white mob who occupied Sojourner Truth Housing, which led to street confrontations between Black families trying to move in the houses allocated to them and the white mob trying to keep them out. So that meant that things were ratcheting up in the summer of 1943, and Ypsilanti, and this should give us all pause. Ypsilanti in the summer of 1943 bans July 4th celebrations in Ypsilanti, the arsenal of democracy, where we're building the bombers that are going to beat the fascists, that are going to win the war, cannot celebrate July 4th for 43, 44, and 45 for fear of race riots in Ypsilanti. So think of that. This is World War II, and Ypsilanti, which is called the Arsenal of Democracy, cannot celebrate the 4th of July for fear of race riots. That is the reality of World War II in Ypsilanti. That is the reality. Okay, let's go. Okay, so here's that race that I was talking about in the landscape. Here is that redlining for Detroit. You can see the Black neighborhoods in Detroit. You can see where the factories are. You can see where Ypsilanti is. You can see here's Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, the two traditional Black neighborhoods of Detroit that will become the targets of the pogroms, which will see dozens of people killed and the U.S. Marines come to the streets in 1943, and then those communities will later be destroyed by the highway system, and we'll see how that works in Ypsilanti. So Willow Run and Willow Lodge. So let's just go through that a little bit because this is the key period in Ypsilanti history. If we want to know why we live where we live today in Ypsilanti and why Ypsilanti's politics are like they are and all of that, it starts really here in World War II. So March 28th, work begins on Willow Run, over $100 million of taxpayers' money. Again, it was built by the U.S. government. Henry Ford leased it with the idea that he would buy it after World War II from the U.S. government, and then he made his profits off it. So he didn't even build Willow Run, right? He just leased it after it was he built it, but with U.S. government funds, and then just leased it, right? This was a huge giveaway in part to Ford. In April, the huge strikes at Ford's Rouge plant, including Black workers, wins the UAW. On June 20th, Ford signs his first contract with the United Auto Workers after the massive Black-white strike at the Rouge. In August, finally, sewer, rail, and highway reached the plant, not the homes, right? The plant has sewer, of course. How could the plant not have sewage and a highway? It's just the homes around it that don't. In 1942, February 11th, the first woman to be hired at the plant is Agnes Menzies, and again, she's hired as a nurse. In February, on the demands, now the demand of the UAW is that the workforce of Willow Run, which is going to grow to 40,000 people, should look like the workforce of the surrounding area. That's the demand. And so the demand is 7% black men work there, 3% black women, because that's what it is in the immediate workforce. And to enforce that, the UAW, even though there are no black people working there at the time, the UAW hires black leadership into the UAW to organize the black workers who will work there, because they will work there, right? They will work there. And so the UAW comes out on front, and even though there are the UAW local 50 at Willow Run, even though by 1942 there are no black workers there, the UAW local will be heavily black because it is trying to organize black people into the union. So black women are refused in February 42, and white women do begin to be hired. February 27th is the Sojourner Truth riots. Ford in May, this is the first time Ford ever asked his opinion, the opinion of Ford was notorious for really caring about his workers' opinions and often talked to them about needs on the line. I'm kidding, right? But in May 1943, he says, it's not me that doesn't want black folks here. It's the white women working here. They don't want black folks here. I went and talked to them, and they all said they didn't want black folks working here. And who am I to deny their needs, right? Well, I'm sure there were racist white women here saying that they refused to work with Henry Ford. I'm sure that Henry Ford did not care what those women thought at all, right? It was his plan. And eventually, in fact, many of those people who began life as racist folks coming from Kentucky to the big city for the first time will become radical union militants in one of the most left-wing radical union locals the UAW has ever had. So if Henry Ford thought bringing people into Kentucky would save him, he was sure to find out different in a couple of years when they were the leaders of the union striking against him. Okay, so here is a letter from John Richardson of 445 Hawkins to President Roosevelt, written during this struggle to get people elected or to employed at the plant. Mr. President, perhaps you have never heard anyone by the above name. One by that name is going to plead with you. My first question I have for you to answer is, are we, the people of the Negro race, too illiterate to work at war jobs other than sweeping floors? It seems to me as if we are not included in this fight for freedom, yet thousands of our boys are on the war fronts of the world are fighting for what is called democracy. I sometimes wonder if there is any democracy. Must we, the Northern Negro, go on seeing white labor is being imported from the South to jobs we would be very good at? There are hundreds of Negro men, not disabled men, but hard workers, are told there is no work for them. Is that democracy at work, Mr. President? The plant I am speaking of is the Ford Willow Run plant. Thank you. That is all, Mr. President, which is enough, don't you think? A citizen. I would love to know more about John Richardson, but there is the actual letter there. That is not up at the Yankee Air Museum, I don't think, but it should be. Uh, um, we get the Carver Center. So the black community here, because there's segregation in the federal housing that's going to finally be built, creates the Carver Center. And that is black women begin taking care of the children of black women instead of taking care of the children of white women. So we see Louise Bass in particular open her home as a rec center, as a community center, and as a nursery for women to be able to go into work, to leave their children and be able to go into these plants, to go into whatever work was available for them, right? And that is called the Carver Center, named after George Washington Carver. It will eventually become a Parkridge Community Center when it is federalized and taken over by the government and all the women are replaced by men. But under pressure, Ford hires 25 black women into the local generator plant, not yet into Willow Run. In December of 42, he hires as a token 6% or six black women rather than the 7% black women that were demanded. So six rather than seven. And those black women were from Ypsilanti. And so Detroit activists come to Ypsilanti to have a little sit down with Ypsilanti's black community to say, we're not agreeing on this unless we all agree on this. And the fact that you agreed to take those jobs puts us in a position. So you can't take those jobs until we all agree to take the jobs on the jobs that we demand, right? So not as nurses, not as janitors, full equality. And so Detroit comes out and they have a little heart to heart with Ipsy and said, we got to be together on this and have the same demands. And so the Ypsilanti stiffens their spine. And I do want to mention this man here in Ypsilanti. He is the pastor of Brown Chapel AME, Henry J. Simmons, and he is the foremost religious leader in Ypsilanti doing all of this work. He's in the National Negro Congress. He is a World War I veteran who went to fight for democracy in World War I and came home to the Red Summers and riots in Chicago and the pogroms in Tulsa, and was going to make sure that that didn't happen to the next generation of black workers, black people like him, who would go off to World War II to fight for democracy and come back to find no democracy. He was determined that was not going to happen. And he opened up Brown Chapel to meetings. He opened it up to the Union. He opened it up to the Communist Party. The Brown Chapel became the basement of Brown Chapel was a one long meeting in the early 1940s as people struggled for services and homes and jobs. And he was central to that. He would end up going to Washington, D.C. to plead the case in Ypsilanti in front of Congress. He would go with a man named Thurgood Marshall to do that pleading of the case, right? This was a national struggle. The entire black nation was looking at what was going on in Willow Run. And eventually at Willow Run, the federal housing is changed. Federal policy is changed, right? And let's get to what happens right before that, and that is Detroit explodes in June 43. So again, there have been multiple race riots in Detroit. Many people think of 1967 as a race riot in Detroit. That's just one. And a race riot traditionally meant white folks getting together in a mob and attacking a black neighborhood, right? That's traditionally what a race riot has meant in this country. Only in the 60s, where black neighborhoods rising up against perceived injustices with the police, et cetera, et cetera. Only in the 60s do we call those urban resistances race riots. Earlier, it was white mobs attacking black communities. And in 1943, it begins on the Belle Isle Bridge with the go-to to start a racial fight. He looked at a white woman, and the fights began on a hot summer day on Belle Isle Bridge, and then moved up Jefferson Avenue. And that area, if you know where that area is, that Paradise or Black Bottom is close to in there. And Black Bottom became the site of this concerted attack by white mobs. You can see white mobs dragging black people off of buses, destroying things here. These two men are actually, we know all three of their names. These men are actually helping this man. They're not hurting him. We know the whole story behind this one here. And then, so the U.S. declares, this is, people are talking about martial law in L.A. right now. It took some days for them to declare martial law in Detroit, and it was not federal; it was state martial law. And about 39 black people had already died when the U.S. Marines came on to the streets of Detroit in the summer of 1943. Again, the same time the U.S. Marines are fighting in the Pacific, they are manning barricades in Detroit because the racist violence of the white majority is so it's off the hook. People are burning, whole neighborhoods are being burnt out in the summer of 1943. So this is what the UAW also has to deal with in creating an interracial movement. It cannot live with this. The union dies in this environment, right? The only way to have the union is to combat this. So you get the UAW saying, membership in the Klan or a racist organization is incompatible with membership of the UAW. Anybody arrested in these kind of race riots are not allowed to be in the UAW. They take a, I don't want to overstate what they did because there were lots of problems with it, lots of limits to it. But without the UAW in Detroit in 1943, I can't imagine of how bad it would have gotten and how bad it would have been. The number of black people who would have been killed, the racial division that would have been even furthered here. It would have been catastrophic, not just for the area, but for the union movement and by extension, the lives of workers for the next generation, right? So thankfully, the UAW was here, black and white UAW was here to try to stem this, and they did it by confronting it. So the fight for services. So the Carver Center is largely black women who are arguing for services. Nobody is getting services. You know, the United States doesn't do services. We will call out the National Guard before we will ever give you a vaccine. I mean, like that's just, you know, like the National Guard will come to arrest you before we'll ever think about a safety measure, right, for you, right? And so services just aren't on anybody's agenda. They're only on agendas when people demand them, right? And we're talking about people who are part of the war effort, who are part of a federally funded war effort to beat fascism and to beat the Mikado in Japan, right? It's not like people are just working. They're part of a federally mandated effort to win a war against fascism, and they don't have homes, right? That has to change. And by late 1943, Black Ypsilanti, Black Detroit, the Black Nation, and the UAW and their supporters are able to fight and win at the federal level and change federal laws. Again, also the United States is fighting fascism, right? They're fighting Nazi racism, and so it looks real bad to be a Nazi racist, right? So there is pressure also from the war and the nature of the war and the fact that the Soviet Union was our ally and going, you guys got a lot of race. They had to answer those charges, right? The United States had to answer for its racism in a war for, in quotes, democracy. And so you saw some moves here, absolutely some moves. By the time Parkridge housing is built on the south side of Ypsilanti, the color line has been broken at Willow Run. So Parkridge is going to be black federal housing. Willow Run is going to be white federal housing. You get the UAW literally picketing the building of Willow Run because it will be segregated. So they are picketing the homes being built for their members, saying they should not be built because they are segregated, right? So that's what the level that the UAW is fighting this. By the time Parkridge is finished, won the court case at Willow Run. And so Willow Run becomes, because of that, because it's federal housing, and you notice how it's split between Superior and Ypsilanti Township. That is to split that working class vote between those two townships and lessen that working class vote to try to keep Republicans at that time in power in both Washington or in both townships, right? That's why they split. That's, you know, nothing is in our landscape by accident, right? So why is part of Willow Run in Superior Township? Why is part of it in Ypsilanti Township? That's the reason, right? That actually creates real difficulties later because it's federal housing. And federal housing means there's federal laws there. So Willow Run becomes the only place, right? It's set up to be only for white people. And because the UAW and Black Detroit and Ypsilanti has won the federal civil rights case, it becomes the only place in suburban Washtenaw County in that suburbanization period of the 50s that Black people can move to. So Willow Run today is one of the most Black parts of the county, and it was designed to be no Black people. And that is the reason it's the most Black today, is because Ypsilanti won that civil rights law and were won the right to live in federal housing, right? Where in federal housing. If that had been private housing, you would have had no rights. And then what happens then when they privatize that federal housing in the 50s and 60s? Those black folks who had to fight in the families who had to fight in the 40s will have to fight all over again as that is privatized and is going to be rebuilt as housing for white folks. And they will have to fight a case where they do not have a legal leg up the way they did in 1943 to be able to stay in the homes that they had fought to win in 1943. It was one long battle. Okay, here's the Carver Center. Here's some of the work that people are doing. Again, remember, we saw Black Ypsilantis. All of these sort of organizations, Black Ypsilanti will create over its timeline to deal with the situation it finds itself in. It doesn't go to white Ypsilanti. It creates its own organizations over and over and over and over again. And here we see the Carver Center. And we see the Carver Center plans double victory ball. What is the double victory? Victory, V, against fascism in Europe. Victory, V, against fascism in the United States. The double V is a fight against fascism across the world and here at the United States. And so that became the way black people, black people talked about the war. If we're going to have a victory against fascism in Europe, there must be a victory against fascism here. The double V victory. That's what it was called. And there's no better way to think about how Black Ypsilanti confronted the period of World War II than the double V. That's how Ypsilanti confronted World War II. The same way Ypsilanti confronted the Civil War with, you're going to take the word white out of your Constitution, right? So we see a tradition that people are being able to call on. Okay, I do need to go through this a little bit, but by July 15th, the first black families move into the Clay Hill section. Now, again, it doesn't mean that black people can move anywhere within Willow Run or what's called Willow Lodge at the time. It's the Clay Hill section up north, and we'll look at a map of that. But here is, if you want to know, and eventually black men and women are hired at Willow Run, but at no point at Willow Run will black employment be higher than 3%. And only at the very end of Willow Run's life will we see those high percentages when Willow Run is closing down, right? Because Willow Run starts, they know they're winning the war. By 44, they're starting to really close down, right? That Willow Run is up and running, really chugging only for about 18 months, right? That's only what it does. We have this image in ourselves that it's longer than that, but it starts really ramping down very quickly. And so a lot of the housing that was built for 40,000 people is now a ghost town. It's literally a ghost town. So Willow Run, that industrial deindustrialization where people are losing jobs in industry, that begins before the end of World War II in Ypsilanti. So Willow Run has 40,000 people working at it at the beginning of 44. By the end of 44, 10,000. That's massive deindustrialization, right? And when the plant again reopens up after the war, it'll be 8,000 people working there. And then when GM runs it in the 70s, there'll be 3,000 people there. So a plant that used to employ 50,000 people, by the end of its life in the 2000s, I think there were just a couple of hundred people working at that plant and not in production at all, right? And yet those plants are also producing huge amounts of material. I think that both Kaiser Frazier and GM were pumping cars out of there just with automation, right? With automation, less workers are needed. But out of these struggles, we get a new black leadership born. And in 1945, I am certain that in the 20s, and I don't have time to go into it here today, but in the 20s, a black person named Will Brown likely won election from the south side of Ypsilanti as a first ward candidate. That was just ignored. That victory was simply ignored. It wasn't until the end of World War II that you get black people running and winning election actually, Ypsilanti is the first place in the state of Michigan where Black people will win election to city council. And the first person to be elected, Black member to be elected to any city council in Michigan is Frank. Where is Frank? There he is, Frank Seymour, right there, and we'll meet him again in a moment. But he wins for the South Side from 1945 in 1945. Um, and we could see the reaction. In part, Henry Ford does not want to keep Willow Run open because the UAW has won so decisively in Ypsilanti, is such a fixture that it can now get Black members elected to city council. And those Black members, like Frank Seymour, are fellow travelers of the Communist Party. Henry Ford has a fit, and you can see here, I'm not going to read it because it's vile language, but this is actually reprinted in The Crisis, the magazine of the NAACP, about how people viewed that and how Henry Ford must have viewed Frank Seymour's election. And it was, we're shutting down Willow Run. See ya. Um, uh, and here's a map of the Clay Hill neighborhood and the Willow Run. This is what it looked like when it was federal housing. Today, Willow Run looks different because it was privatized and rebuilt, and there's very little of the federal housing peeking through what is Willow Run today. But there's parts of it, and you can see it. And so this is Clay Hill in the north part of where MacArthur Boulevard is today. And then there's two schools close. So this, you see how the Black section is isolated from the other sections of the area. There's two schools. There's Ross School and there's Simmons School over here. This is much closer to the Black neighborhood, but it requires Black folks walking through a white neighborhood to go to. Who wants to guess which will become the Black school? This will become the Black school over here, right? So you didn't have to walk through any white neighborhood. So even though Willow Run is internally or is desegregated, internally is segregated. We won't miss that. That's going to be part of this. I don't have time to read this. This is an editorial from the Michigan Black Michigan newspaper called the Michigan Chronicle. But I hope that you download the PDF and read it to yourself at home and find out how much of the crystal ball, thinking about what it would mean to create a racially segregated Willow Run would mean for the people of Ypsilanti, written in 1943. Think about how prescient that crystal ball was. Whoever wrote that, A plus, A plus. It's really damning. It's really damning. So Black political power in the UAW. For the first time, white workers are willing to vote for a Black person on the basis of class rather than race. All previously, white folks, working class white folks are voting for white people on the basis of race, not class. And now, because of the UAW, a good number of white folks, white workers, are willing to vote for a Black man on the basis of race or class and not race. That's a massive shift. Massive shift in the politics of this country. And it means that you can get Black people elected to even majority white communities that are UAW. So in 1967, there are only 7 cities in the entire United States that are majority Black that have, or majority white that have Black mayors. Let me say it again. In 1967, there are 7 cities in the United States that are majority white that have Black mayors. 3 of them are in Michigan. And if I tell you those 3, you'll say that's the UAW. Flint, Saginaw, Ypsilanti. Flint, Saginaw, and Ypsilanti all have Black mayors of majority white communities because those Black mayors, those Black are part of the UAW movement, right? That has transformed political life and who can get elected and who can't. So the first Black elected official is anywhere in Michigan. There are other Black appointed officials, but I believe on the city level, Frank Seymour is the first Black elected official of any city in Michigan. He's elected in 1945, and Ypsilanti decides that they're going to change the city charter in response to his election and say a couple of things. One, you can't be a renter and run for city council. right? So that leaves out a lot of just working people in general. You have to have lived here for a certain number of years, right? And right, so it was designed to keep black people and working people from winning the next election. So in the next election was 1947, and Black Ypsilanti said, "What are we going to do about this?" And they decided to put forward two candidates. Oh, and also there would be no more ward voting in Ypsilanti. So, the fact that Black Ypsilanti had a majority in the first ward meant that they could get somebody elected. And Ypsilanti changed that as well to try to prevent another black person from getting elected in Ypsilanti. And Black Ypsilanti decided to split the difference, and they were going to put two people forward. Frank Seymour again as the left wing person, and then Amos. Oh, I'm going to miss his last name. Amos, missing his last name, as the conservative kind of business owners. So they're going to appeal to white workers and white conservatives, right? Not black people with those people. And both of them get elected in 1947. Both of them get elected in 1947. Eula Tate is the second black woman elected to city council. She was the president of Local 854 right here in Ypsilanti, and she would become the second leader of the Congress or the Coalition of Labor Union Women, CLU, to come from Ypsilanti. The founder of it also comes from Ypsilanti, Olga Madar. The first black mayor of Ypsilanti, and that was in 1967, so he's mayor during that period, is John H. Burton, and he's education director of Local 600 of the UAW, based at the Rouge plant. That's the big, huge Rouge plant. So the UAW brought the strength of the UAW brought black people to political power in Michigan, right? That's who Coleman Young comes out of. He comes out of that UAW tradition. In fact, Coleman Young and Seymour worked together in the UAW. They were close allies together in the UAW. And what we're seeing with the retreat of the UAW is the retreat of black political power in Michigan, right? So Duggan, a figure like Duggan, can get elected mayor in Detroit, and previously you would have needed a pretty big buy-in from the black UAW to be elected mayor of Detroit, and the UAW has lost with the jobs its power, and with that, black people have also lost political power. So this notion that unions only helped white people is utterly false. Utterly false. If it weren't for unions, there would be no black middle class. If there weren't for unions, there would be no black school teachers. If there weren't for unions, there would be no black members of city council in Ypsilanti, right? Unions were key. They broke the logjam. They broke the political logjam. I think that they will be key in the future again to Black freedom movement. Okay, we're gonna start wrapping up now with more looks at our landscape. So again, that period of World War II is the period that creates modern Ypsilanti. So you can see in 1940, there's Michigan Avenue. That's Willow Run. It's actually a lake or a river, right? This is Willow. This is what it looks like. This is 1960, but that's more or less what it looked like in 1950, right? Or even 1945. So this is 5 years difference. The city goes from a small industrial town with a well-known college to one of the largest industrial centers in Southeast Michigan, closely connected to Detroit, right? Closely connected to Detroit. So it changes. I think eastern part of Washtenaw County is far more Detroit. I think Ann Arbor thinks we look to Ann Arbor. We do not. We look to Detroit. Ann Arbor looks to Ypsilanti. Ypsilanti looks to Detroit. Culturally, politically, where we work, all of those things were more geared towards Detroit. And the further east you go in the county, the more that's true, right? The more that's true. So let's just quickly, Washtenaw County population in 1940, 80,000, 1950, 130. I mean, that's just an extraordinary change. Ypsilanti City District goes from 12.9% black to 23% black. Ypsilanti Township population, 4,000 to 14,000. Look, Superior Township was basically just a farming community, and it 8 times that number. Ypsilanti had 0 CIO members in 1939. In 1949, it had 2,800 members of the CIO. in this city. We look at the population of this city. You were a member of the CIO in this town, and thousands in other unions. In 1939, Michigan had only 79 UAW locals and 110,000 members. In 1949, it had 300 locals and almost 500,000 members. 500,000 members. By the end, again, Ypsilanti had 0 CIO members in 1939. At the end of 1959, Washtenaw County was 60% unionized. 60% unionized. When we look back and go, times were better then, we don't mean when people had a job in a factory. The factory job is irrelevant. The fact that they had a union job is what matters, right? They had health care, they had a pension, their children could go to college, right? Whether that was a factory or a hospital is irrelevant. They had a union job. The fact that we don't have union jobs is the problem. The fact that we don't have factory jobs is incidental to that problem. Okay, the Cold War and cutbacks. You can imagine there was going to be a reaction. There was going to be a reaction to the great gains unionization had made, the great gains that Black people had made. The communist movement was incredibly strong in World War II. It would change right after World War II with the beginning of the Cold War. But remember, the Soviet Union is an ally during that period. So there's not the kind of anti-communism during the war, which also turns into anti-Black and anti-unionism that we'll see after the war, right? But it begins, and it begins in 1947, 48. We get that reaction. I don't know if people know the Henry Wallace campaign, not George Wallace, Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was FDR's agricultural secretary, and he was considered the most progressive person. And he was going to run for president. And when Truman ran as a very conservative person, Wallace ran as a progressive independent, and all of the Black churches around here supported. That was Paul Robeson's campaign. All of the Black churches around here would have supported Wallace. Wallace had huge support at the beginning of 1948. By the time the election happened in November of 48, the Cold War was on, the Berlin airlift had started, and the crackdown had come. And so we see this man here, Tommy Dennis, who was the leader of the local communist youth group and the UAW here. The communist youth group was called the Young Comrades. And they put together, when they went before the House Un-American Affairs Committee and they were listing their nefarious deeds they did during the war, one of the things they charged this young man with doing was building a playground at Parkridge Community Center. That's that's literally what people were doing, right? I think when we think of the communists, think of them as having church sales and bake sales and trying to build playgrounds. That's what they were doing in the World War II, regardless of what we think they were doing. And this is Tommy Dennis. The Dennis family still lives on South Adams Street. Tommy Dennis was a major figure in the UAW and a major figure in the Communist Party. He would be arrested and found guilty of sedition and sent to prison for a number of years. So, but I'm saying all of that because during World War II, when he was also an open communist, he was celebrated in the city. He was, he was not an enemy. By 1948, 5 years later, the same man who was celebrated by the Ypsilanti press is being called a communist who should be put in prison. So we're seeing this huge shift too by the end of the war. Tommy Dennis, his wife just recently died. He would become a major figure in the Communist Party and end up being the editor of its newspaper in the 70s. Amos Washington is the name of the other person who ran in 1947. Here is the South Side before Urban Renewal, and I promise you we'll be ending right around here. One of the things you can see, so this is how you get on the highway, right? Or this is Huron, South Huron Drive. Here's the highway now. This is before the on-ramp is there, right? This is Harriet Street. This is Harriet School, Perry School. This street is not there anymore. It's called Monroe, right? Monroe Street. This is Hamilton Street. So the Black business district was this area. So not just Harriet Street. It went up here and then down Monroe. And there was even over here an additional car barn for the streetcar services. So Black Ypsilanti even had its own streetcar service, not line, but stop to come down to the south side of Ypsilanti at the what was called the business district. Now you can tell it's not Rodeo Drive, right? A lot of these shops are out of people's homes and stuff like that, but it is a living commercial center. There are clothes stores, there are bars, there are restaurants. You don't need to go into downtown Ypsilanti where you might get arrested or bullied for anything. You can stay on the south side, you can stay on Harriet Street and Monroe, and there's also a large number of black businesses here. There are a large number of black businesses. And then one of the things here you see is the city dump. Now, the city dump, do we think that the city dump was placed there or the black community grew up around the city dump? So which came first is the question. And, that's an interesting question because if the city dump is already there and black people are forced to live next to the city dump, that tells us one thing. And then if black people are already living there and the city dump is moved there, that tells us another thing, right, about power. Well, it's black people who are already living there, and the city dump is moved there. So the city dump used to be a number of places over by where Corner Brewery is now, in the bottomlands there. I mean, you could still find dumps down there. And then there was a couple of places here and there around. And then the main city dump was down right off of South Grove, South Huron, in this area, and it would catch fire all the time. And that became a real inconvenience for the highway, apparently not for the people who lived around here, because smoke would go over the highway. I'm sure some of you old enough will remember driving in and out of Ypsilanti and not being able to see because the smoke from the city dump over the highway. So eventually the city had to move the dump. Again, not because black people were complaining about it, but because the highway was complaining about it. But I think that tells us a lot, right? Where things go in our landscape are racially determined as well as class. They're determined by power. A city dump, that goes where the people have the least amount of power to say, I don't want a city dump near me, right? And where does a highway go? Where does a highway go? Let's look at the highway system and then we'll end around here. So here is the south side of Ypsilanti before the highway system. This is 1940. So here is Harriet Street. You can see some of the old orchards still there. Here's like Monroe and Madison and all of that, right? So there's 1940. And then after the war, you get the highway put in. And here's the highway as it's coming. And you can see there goes the city dump, right? So there's 1960. And you can see there's no off and on ramp, right? So the highway comes in. And there's an over ramp, which is Huron Street, but the off ramp is over here, where Farmer Jack is, where Galt Village is, right? So think about what's going on. This is the 1950s. We're suburbanizing. The highway comes in, and rather than the highway service the existing community, we're going to create the off ramp to exist the speculation in the suburban buildings, right? That's what we're going to do. And so the off-ramp goes not to serve Ypsilanti, but to serve the grocery stores and all of that kind of stuff that are going to be on Galt Village. So immediately you've got a problem, which is Ypsilanti's downtown business district, the white business district, is in a real crisis because nobody is coming to downtown businesses anymore. They're going to the suburbs, to the box stores. And more than that, Eastern Michigan University is changing to become a big college, right? They're going to become from Eastern Michigan College to Eastern Michigan University. And to be a university, one must have a football team. If one does not have a football team, why call oneself a place of learning? And so Eastern Michigan University they're going to build that big stadium up there, and they need some access from the highway to that stadium. So what we get is downtown, and of course, downtown Ypsilanti, those businesses, those are gone, right? We haven't had a grocery store, a big chain grocery store in downtown Ypsilanti since A&P closed around this period, right? So the idea that what is downtown Ypsilanti going to do? Because it's about then bringing people into the city. So people are thinking now, what can Ypsilanti do to bring people into the city, right? So the shops and services that Ypsilanti is going to begin to offer as a reason for you to come to Ypsilanti have nothing to do with living here, right? Before it might be a hardware store, a grocery store, health, something like that, right? Things you need on a daily basis. But if you're trying to bring people here, you're bringing them in here for a niche, right? And so it becomes, and I have nothing against it, but it becomes antique stores and rock stores, right? It becomes things that people will drive from Brighton to get off the highway to come to. It has nothing to do with the people who live here. And the demands then for the highway and the business district is to bring people in from outside of Ypsilanti. It is not to service Ypsilanti. And so what we see is the demand for a highway to service the white downtown business district and Eastern Michigan University. So we need an on-ramp to service them. The problem is there's a black business district in the way. So the white business district in downtown that is dying, that doesn't offer services for people who live there, and the stadium that has yet to be built, they trump, literally, they trump in existing black communities, existing real social relationships, existing real services they are providing. And what we see is this off ramp comes in to create, an on off ramp for Ypsilanti, and that requires the destruction of the business district, right? So there's the business district. There's the business district. What is there at the business district now? That is that big warehouse. And again, it's to take advantage of the highway. It's a warehouse for international foods. You can get the truck in and out of the highway. I believe that 10, 15 people work there. It laid empty for decades, right? So that's what we got for on the south side. And then you have a highway here. Now, again, who do highways go through Barton Hills? No. In, in fact, nobody needs to tell a planner that a highway that you are not going to move the richest people for a highway, right? Nobody needs to tell the planners that. Automatically, when they look at a map, Barton Hills is not in where they plan to put the highway. Where they plan to put the highway is where the people have the least amount of power to say, no, I don't want a highway. That's where you put a highway. Nobody wants a highway. And Black Ypsilanti didn't want this highway. It doesn't service them. It destroys their literally destroyed their community. But Black Ypsilanti has to have that highway because white Ypsilanti demands it so they can sell antiques on Sundays, right? And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it makes the point about who has power and why decisions are made. And they are not made for the community, white or black, right? They are made for people with power. Where on and off ramps go on the highway are not made because where people live, right? We've seen that. That's irrelevant. They're made to where people are speculating to make money. That's where you put an off and on ramp, right? And so we can see race, class, and power in this highway system. And you can see it in every city in the United States. Every city in the United States, highways have been used to remove working people, have been used to gentrify. It's a very fundamental fact of the highway systems. A highway is a gentrifier. A highway is a gentrifier. Okay, we're going to wrap up with the 1970 student strike at EMU. And it's a way to wrap up, I think. It's the Eastern Michigan University began as a teaching college. And when Black folks first began to go to college in large numbers after the defeat of Brown Board and all of that in the mid-60s, many went into teaching, right? With the idea of service to now we can finally have Black teachers in Black schools. Finally, right? And so the Eastern Michigan's education department, being where it is in Southeast Michigan, became a Black college. So did the social work school. They became predominantly, or at least the education school became predominantly Black. The social work school, people may know better than me, became at least Black focused, if not a predominantly Black college orientation. And up until the first I came to Ypsilanti 30 years ago, 25 years ago, Eastern Michigan was largely considered a black school, or it was considered, the colleges in it were black, right? Social work, education. There were uh, big black conferences that were held at Eastern Michigan, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the head of the UAW, the head of the Michigan, Eastern Michigan, of the cafeteria workers and the janitors and all of that, his name is Floyd Flick Kersey. Remember that name, Kersey? Well, he's a worker. He's a cafeteria worker, and he doesn't go to school, right? But he brings out all of the cafeteria workers, all of the janitors, not just him. The union comes out in support of the Black student strike, the Student Liberation Action Movement strike in the late 60s, demanding Black Studies program, Black professors, et cetera, et cetera. So the Black unionists who were thinking, I think, of their children, and the community as a large. They're not. This has nothing to do with their working conditions, nothing to do with their contract, but they Flick Kersey, the Kersey, bring out on strike in support of those Black student demands, right? And so for the first time, instead of Eastern being a somewhat parasitical, a parasite on Black Ypsilanti and on large Ypsilanti, I mean, it sucks things out rather. I mean, I know it likes to say that it gives lots of stuff to us, but I think people living here would tend to disagree, right? But it certainly had very little to do with Black Ypsilanti, right? So the major Ypsilanti institution virtually ignored 30% of its population here for its entire existence, until the late 60s and early 70s. And that's the first time we see Eastern really seeming to be a part of Black Ypsilanti, right? That period, that time. Now, that didn't last long. But I think there was a time where Eastern was considered part of Black Ypsilanti. And most of you will be surprised to hear that, I think, knowing how Eastern fares today in Ypsilanti. But I think there was a conscious effort on the part of Eastern to put butts in seats and move away from identifying with a Black college and Black students and Black studies, because that would prevent maximizing the number of white students we can get here and get butts in seats. And so I think that I know that there was a real downshift in the departments that were really Black: social work, education, and a real uptick in engineering and the things that they wanted to get white students in. That has a consequence. And one of those consequences is Eastern Michigan is now a cold house to Black Ypsilanti and is viewed as such by Black Ypsilanti, right? So we have a real situation here where we have a conflictual relationship. The fact that Eastern Michigan has students coming in every year means that prices on rents can be changed every year, right? It means there's a constant upward pressure on rents, and that's devastating here in Ypsilanti. And again, once we took out the federal housing, which was the anchor, right? You could not be removed from that federal housing. Now, defunding federal housing was horrific, and it forced people to live in substandard buildings and all of that. But in the beginning, federal housing was very much a step up for most people. Most workers, white or Black, lived in tenements. They didn't have plumbing and all of that kind of stuff until the demands for federal. So federal housing was a step up. It also took housing out of the market, which meant that it wasn't racialized the way that the market racializes all housing. And that, in part, has kept Ypsilanti free from gentrification until recently. And we've seen a privatization of public housing. So people can make money off of public housing. It's no longer public, right? It's in somebody else's interest. And it's not a coincidence that when that happened, the South Side began to see greater gentrification, right? They had broken the anchor that had meant that Black people could stay in this community no matter what. That anchor was broken because of the deindustrialization, because the larger crisis of people losing their jobs. So we've gone through a huge history here of Ypsilanti. It began with speculation and gentrifying an Indian neighborhood, and unfortunately, it's ending in speculation and the gentrification of a Black neighborhood. But that's the history of Ypsilanti.